I'm pleased today to welcome to the White House staff one of the nation's most respected journalists and commentators, David Gergen.
Good afternoon, and welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm Michael Duffy, opinions editor at large at the Post. And our guest today is David Gergen, a man who needs no introduction. He was the founding director of the Center for Public Leadership at Harvard's Kennedy School. He was an advisor to at least four American presidents, and he's the author of a new book, Hearts Touched with Fire: How Great Leaders Are Made. Dave Gergen, welcome to Washington Post Live.
Thank you, Michael. It's good to see you again.
Great to be with you. Dave, tell us why you wrote this book, just to start off the conversation.
Sure. Well, it's been sort of building up. I've been teaching leadership courses at the Kennedy School for almost a quarter century now. And, I've acquired some thoughts and reflections on that, as well as for my own background. And I've reached the age where you really want to pass on to a new generation some of the things you've learned. Maybe you can help them a little bit. And I enjoyed writing it, too, because it brought back so many memories. Not only from history, but from personal experiences. And I love good stories. I think they help to tell a narrative about our lives and about the perils we now face as a country.
Well, let's talk about some of those presidents you worked for. But I just want to remind the audience that before we do that, we'd love to hear from you. And you can send your thoughts and questions for our guest on Washington Post Live today by tweeting at Post Live. And we encourage you to do so. David's worked for four presidents: President Nixon, President Ford, President Reagan, and of course President Clinton. There may have been other more informal conversations along the way, but four's enough. That's close to as many as anyone has ever had. So let's start at the beginning, Dave. President Nixon, just remind us what role you played in that White House, and speak a little bit about his leadership strengths and weaknesses.
Sure. Well, after going to law school, I went in the Navy for 3.5 years. And toward the end of that period, I was called back to work on draft reform because the President Nixon had ordered up a random lottery, the first random lottery, and it was botched. And they were looking for a young team to come in and help them not only have a random lottery, but also to reform and change the loopholes, close the loopholes in the draft system. So I was honored to do that. That process was overseen by a good friend of mine, a person I went to law school with, a roommate, who was in the West Wing and working in the West Wing of the White House. And we worked together then on draft reform. But he introduced me to the White House crowd. And then as I was coming out of the Navy, I thought I was going home to North Carolina. And I was interviewing there at the Institute of Government in Chapel Hill when I got a call asking me if I'd come to the White House and actually take a job working there as an assistant to someone named Ray Price, who was then head of the speechwriting and research team, a big group, about 50 people. And he was looking for someone to be, administrative type. He hired me. He did not know I was a blockhead when it came to administration. That was one of my great weaknesses in life. But I went to work for Ray, and then he eventually asked to move over to a counselor role about a year or so in, and Nixon asked me, and Bob Haldeman asked me if I would run the speechwriting and research team, which I did for about, I guess, the last year and a half. And one of the big questions, of course, during that time was, what happened in Watergate? What was the real truth? Are we guilty of this? Did the other, is this made up? Haldeman, Ehrlichman would tell me, Bob Woodward making all of this stuff up. But I got to know Bob. We had been a year apart at Yale, and we got to know each other in Washington. So I had some friends there in the administration, And I went to work there for a year because I had voted for Hubert Humphrey, my first vote. And I told them that. And they said, well, that's not an advertisement, but we do need an alternative perspective around here. And that's what Ray told me. And so let's have you come in for a year. Well, it turned out I stayed 3.5, much longer than I expected. I was there on the final goodbyes, as Nixon's walked out to the helicopter and waved goodbye. And it was a big learning experience. I frankly thought, Michael, having worked for Nixon, I was done in American public life. There was a sense inside the White House that we were playing like the White Sox, the Black Sox of 1923, who threw the World Series, and the players never came back again. Well, there was that sense that we would never come back, but things were in flux, and I eventually wound up going over to work at the Treasury Department for Bill Simon, and then I was asked to come back to the White House to work for President Ford. Don Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney asked me to come back, which I did, and I was there with Ford for a year plus.
Would you say Ford was not the leader that Nixon was, or in some ways a better leader?
Let's put it this way. Nixon was a much better strategist, the best I've seen in public life. Winston Churchill used to argue that someone who read history and looked back could see farther into the future. Well, that was Nixon. He loved to read. He was a good strategist. He worked closely with Henry Kissinger on the China, Russia, splitting them apart. And had that been all there was to his presidency, he would have been a fairly good one. But as you know, Michael, he, as the Washington Post really uncovered, he had demons inside him that he had never learned to control. And they did him in. David Frost had an interview with him after Watergate was over. He said, how did that happen? Why? What happened? And Nixon said, I gave my enemies a sword, and then they ran me through. And that was true. He did give his enemies a sword. And he was the author of his own demise. He had to go. It was a scandal. He had to go.
Did you? You wrote in the book that you found Gerald Ford. Certainly, he had no demons, but you wrote that he was squishy. What did you mean, and how did that manifest itself?
Well, squishy means I think I borrowed that from Margaret Thatcher. Probably, they talked about some conservatives are hard and some are squishy, and the ones who are squishy are the ones who are seen by their other conservatives as too willing to work with the other side. And Jerry Ford was part of that group. There were a lot of conservative Republicans wanted to bring him down. And they got Kissinger. They got him out of the. Remember, they managed to get him out of the premises, and that worked, but at detriment to the country. So, but the thing that was antithesis about Ford to Nixon was that Ford was honest, and he felt that transparency and trust were the glue that held the system together, and he tried to practice that. And what I found, Michael, about leaders is that the followers, the people who are working for them, they take their cues from the leader. If you're working for Richard Nixon, there was a tendency to cut corners and tell lies. If you're working for Jerry Ford, honest as the day is long, your tendency was tell the truth. And it was in the Nixon days. There was a lot of resentments and animosities among the group. In the Ford days, we were a pretty happy bunch. It worked out pretty well.
The next president you worked for, of course, was Ronald Reagan, who was in his time and still seen as a revolutionary president, but also one of great positive disposition.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about that combination, since we don't see them usually in tandem.
Yeah. Well, Reagan, in my judgment, and he was more conservative than I was. I'm pretty liberal on social issues, pro-choice, for example.
I won't.
But
I won't.
No, don't tell. Yeah. But anyway, I thought Reagan turned out to be the best leader as president since Jack Kennedy. There was an equanimity about him, that he didn't have to be president. He wasn't a driven man the way Nixon was, and to a degree Bill Clinton turned out to be. But rather he was pretty happy with life, and he didn't need the presidency in order to feel he had a good life. And I think that it relaxed him a little bit. But I think the shooting actually transformed him in the public eye. before that, people thought maybe Reagan was, he was seen to be a nice guy, but was he tough enough to be president? And then he was shot, and he took that bullet and walked away with a smile, and that made people convinced a lot of Americans. The guy's pretty tough, and he had what I think was perhaps more respect for the office of the president than I've seen in a long time. When he was shot, he intentionally got out of the car on the side that the press couldn't see him, and then he stood up, he buttoned his coat, he walked back around the car to where they could see him, and he crossed the street there, in the emergency area, and people saw him doing that, walking over, and then when they could no longer see him, he collapsed into the arms of the surgeons. And it was important for him to send a message that the president wasn't down groveling on the floor, been shot, and the United States was still in good hands, and that was important. I think he had his eye on the big important things, and did pretty well by him. Now, he was the father of a lot of modern conservatism, but the conservatism we see from Trump is vastly different from Reagan, and I think Reagan will be among the first to condemn it. He didn't like the radical wing of the party very much. He didn't like people who came in and tried to bully him into doing things, because he wanted to do it his own way. And I think that's one of the strengths that he had. But again, coming back to there are a lot of lessons to be learned from each of these presidents.
Talk a little bit more about this element of the Republican Party, which, as you know, has been present for decades, but most of all the Republicans you worked for were conscious of it, and I wouldn't say tamped it down or kept it in a box, but they were aware that it was something that had to be managed.
Yes.
How conscious was that? Even in the 70s, how conscious were Republican leaders of this element of the party that has now become the dominant element?
Well, yeah, for a long time, tensions have been building up. There were, in effect, two wings to the Republican Party. There was the Barry Goldwater wing, which was gathering, momentum in the Southwest and in much of the rest of the South. And then there was the establishment wing, the establishmentarians, and they're mostly Northeast. And it was, people like Tom Dewey. And there were real breaks between those two, and they went in different directions, but they were banging heads a lot. But and then Eisenhower came along, and he sort of transcended that view. And then when Nixon came in 1968, all that stuff came back into focus. I put Nixon on the ticket as vice president because Nixon had come to represent that scrappy Goldwater-ish kind of view, and Eisenhower, Western. And Eisenhower himself was much more, at home, more congenial, and a more establishmentarian. He'd been president of Columbia. He'd done a variety of other things, which really put him in the thick of things. And of course, he was potential president for a long time.
I don't think any of those presidents could have imagined a Republican Party that exists today. Do you, David?
I don't know of any of them who would accept it, which is, I think, a more important test. I just don't think they would have been swept up. But Barry Goldwater, at the end of the day, had a lot of establishment qualities about him as well. He wasn't angry at the world. So I do honestly believe that the Republican Party has been, in effect, taken hostage by elements that too many sort of bowed and scraped early on and let him get away with this. And I think it's done grave damage in the long run to the presidency as an institution, because it's become so much more politicized. That process did have long roots. I do think the process of politicization really intensified in the 1990s with the coming of the baby boomers into running the show. And the World War II veterans leaving the stage. I have always believed, Michael, that the generation that did serve us the best as a country was what Tom Brokaw identifies as the greatest generation, was that World War II group. They were running things when I got to Washington. I thought they were splendid. I came away with enormous respect for them, and I miss them still. I thought they were just fine people. I mean, and the relationship, the Dan Inouye friendship with Bob Dole, being in the same hospital together in the war in the Italian peninsula, and becoming friends there. Those friendships lasted all their lives. When I first went to see George H.W. Bush in Kennebunk, he asked me to come up for a weekend to see if I wanted to work for him. The first thing I found when I got into his house was he had a Democratic congressman staying for the weekend. They were personal friends. They have different politics, but they were personal friends and the friendship, transcended these other things. So I like that generation a lot. I felt very comfortable with them. The generations come now is, well, it is what it is. But I think
Let's talk. Go ahead.
Go ahead. Well,
I was going to say.
I think as a
Please.
general prophet and broadening out from Trump, I think we're at a stage now where in the natural course of things, the people running the White House, the people running much of the Congress are octogenarians. They're people who've gone into their 90s. And I do think that there is as a general proposition, it would be wise and helpful for the octogenarians to start turning over, to pass the torch to a new generation of younger leaders, emerging leaders, and so we can get some fresh blood.
You say that
Yes.
as someone who is now 80 yourself, right?
Yeah, as 80 years old, I can just tell you, you don't have the same coordination you had before. Your mental capacity does. There's a sense that it's drifting downward. You're on a downward glide path. You're more forgetful. There are a lot of things that start happening. It doesn't mean you can't do a good job somewhere in an organization, but you shouldn't be running the largest, most powerful, most complex institution in the world. In a situation where you're on your own glide path, nobody knows quite what it is. Your doctors are not going to tell it to you straight, or at least won't tell the public straight. And what are we electing? What we know is that age can catch up with people. Look at Woodrow Wilson, how he collapsed the last 2 years of his presidency because of his stroke. We don't want to be in a position where you don't know from one week to the next whether your president is going to have health problems. It's just too much of a risk, and we will find other nations trying to take advantage of it.
You've called in the course of publicizing the book for Joe Biden not to run for a second term. Biden is currently 79. Donald Trump is 75. I think Mitch McConnell is 80. I think Nancy Pelosi is 82.
Yeah. Yes.
Is it important for Biden to step aside if everyone else who is his age stays in the game? Is it as important?
That's a really, really good question. I do think it's important for Biden and Trump to step aside on the presidential run. I think and if one won't do it, the other one won't do it. So it's going to be a long shot. But I think if serious people begin to focus on it, they'll tell you this is not a good idea. Age does catch up with you. Embrace it. Don't try to fight it all the time. And I think in the end, Joe Biden will try to do the right thing. I think that depending on what happens on the midterms, there will be pressure on him. If the Democrats lose the House, there will be pressure on him anyway to take a second look and not run. But it's going to be hard. It's going to be a hard choice.
Yeah, one of the reasons it's going to be a hard choice, and you can speak to this, I think, from your unusual perspective of having watched presidents up close, is no matter their age, they don't cede the stage very often. In fact, I wonder if it's even in their ability. What do you think? Is it possible for a president to just step back? No matter the age, are they wired for that? What do you think?
Well, they're wired against it by and large. But there are some presidents who don't need the office. I mean, to feel like they've had a good life. That was Ronald Reagan, and there are other presidents like Nixon who cling to power. And I think Joe Biden, we'll leave it up to him. But this is not a reflection on him as a person. It's not a reflection on his character. It's not a reflection on the accomplishments he has racked up. It is really a focus on the health of the person who's engaged, and your physical health, your mental health. All those things are really important as president. it is the most complex job in the world. It does require a sense of judgment and keen judgment. Michael, the issues that come before a president tend to be hard issues, hard decisions. They're usually 51-49 type decisions. If it's 60-40, you don't need to spend time in the Oval Office. You just get that done. But if it's 51-49, you've got to spend a lot of time with the president trying to make sure he understands the data, understands the evidence, understands the politics, understands how to connect with the country, and understands how to deal with foreign nations. There's a lot on your plate right there. And a man in his 50s is so much stronger and brings a more vitality and often brings better judgment than people who are in their 80s. And this is, again, not a reflection on sort of the person, but it is simply a recognition that life changes as you get older. And for the sake of the country, not for the sake of the person, I think it'd be wise to sort of think, I want to support somebody else in this.
Let's talk about a younger president that we haven't discussed, Bill Clinton, for whom you went to work in late 1993, as I recall. You write in the book that when you got there, you saw a Bill Clinton you didn't recognize, one who had lost his confidence. This was about 9 or 10 months in, as I recall, into the first term.
About half.
Just talk a little bit about that, and how did he get it back?
Well, I had known Bill Clinton for a long time. We had been friends. I covered him journalistically, but more importantly, we just spent time together. I talked to him. He called me the night he declared and what he was going through, and I had a lot of faith in Bill Clinton. He was, he's widely seen as one of the 10 best governors of the 20th century. He was a very, very good governor in Arkansas. It's the reason he was reelected so many times. And so I thought he brought all that strength to the White House, and he did bring it. But then he got battered in those early months. There was some, he slipped on some banana peels, and he wound up getting. Frankly, he wasn't himself, and that's when he and Mac McClarty, the chief of staff, reached out to me to ask me if I would come help. And I'm a traditionalist by heart. And when a president of the United States says, I'm in trouble, can you come help me? I think the appropriate answer is, what time do I report? And so I wanted to help him, and I stayed longer than I expected. But I did keep him out of I stayed out of politics. His politics were against Republicans. He was good about that. But in any event, it was, what I found when I got there was that Bill Clinton I knew, as you say, was not the same person I found in the Oval Office. He had lost his self-confidence, and he wasn't quite sure what to do about it. He was floundering. And that's when he sort of reached out. He thought maybe because I had been in Washington a lot and I knew him pretty well, that I could help him find that rebalance. And Hillary was not in good shape at all. She was going through much the same thing. It's important to understand that when you go from a small state to the White House, it's very different from going from California or New York to the White House. In a small state like Arkansas or Georgia, Jimmy Carter, you're just not prepared for the complexity that you find in Washington and all the cross currents and everything else. And you need a little bit of someone to help you sort of navigate that. So anyway, my thought coming in was, we don't want to try to change Bill Clinton. I learned this under Reagan when he was under some fire. We didn't try to change Reagan. What we tried to do was let Reagan be Reagan. And that's what I decided we thought to do with Clinton. Let him be himself. Let him succeed at a couple of things. Create a zone around him when he has some safety. He has some psychological safety. Keep working on it just to play to his strengths. He's a great speaker. He's a great this. He's great that. Play to those strengths. Let them come out. And gradually he will recover his self-confidence. And that's what happened. And people wrote, well, some people wrote that I'd gotten him out of a ditch. I didn't get him out of any ditch. He got there himself. It was entirely, he figured out what he needed to do. He had some support. We gave him some support, but he was the one who deserves all the credit for putting himself back out there. And he became a much better president, frankly.
Are you still in touch with him?
I haven't talked to him for a while. We do cross paths. I see Hillary periodically, but the truth is I haven't seen him for some months.
Do you, looking back on that, what advice would you have to other leaders in whatever role they play when they do lose their confidence? What's the most important thing for people to remember, would you say?
Well, I think it's important that they quietly find people who are well anchored, who are it usually starts with the spouse. A strong spouse like a Lady Bird Johnson can do a lot to anchor and to keep her husband under better control. And Nancy played some of that role with Reagan, and she also kept a keen eye, stern eye out for anybody who wanted to upstage Reagan in the White House. And she chased Don Reagan out of there. Um, but I do think you need to have. I think every leader, frankly, of any significant organization needs to have at least one or two people that he can talk straight or she can talk straight with. You need a quiet space, a safe space where you can let down your hair. You can tell people, share people with people, your friends, your close-in friends. What the hellishness you're going through, and get their advice. Just knowing that there are one or two people out there, longtime buddies or friends or mentors who are in your corner still. That helps a lot. It helps you to stabilize. You don't feel that you're so alone, battling the world.
So I want to close by asking you to make a couple of predictions. One rarely visited David Gergen in the White House without having at least a minute or two at the end of an interview to ask him to look into the crystal ball. That would have been a waste of a visit. How will the midterms go in your view? What's the likely prospect? And talk to us a little bit, and we only have a minute or two left, about what you see shaping up to be the field in 2024.
Well, I think we're still on glide path to the Republicans winning the House. I think the Senate is more unpredictable. There's some interesting candidates out there. The chances are the Democrats may have a better chance in the Senate than in the House. But on the 2024, I don't know. I think there are big questions on both sides of the aisle about, if it's Trump, where does he go? He's not going to go to Pence. But he diminishes everybody who comes at him. Is DeSantis really going to try to let the water out of the bathtub on Trump? Who knows? But I think that's a fascinating question. The Democratic side is even more, I think, iffy or questionable. If Biden decides to run, there's going to be all the obvious things. I think the really interesting question becomes, if Biden decides not to run, what happens? What happens to Kamala Harris? You've got two groups in the White House around her. The best I can tell, you've got one group who thinks that she would not be a good candidate, should not run as the nominee of the party. Whereas you have people, there are a lot of people, especially in the Black community, for whom admiration for Kamala Harris has gone way up. It skyrocketed here in recent days, and that she would be, and to force her off the ticket would be an act of betrayal. That she came in as vice president, and with obviously with the possibility that she might become president, because Biden was a fairly senior older guy, and so they've assumed, I think, that she has the inside track if there's an opening there. But there are just a lot of people who don't want to do that. I don't know what they're going to do about that. I don't know how they manage to get through that without some blood being spilled on the floor. So in both parties, I think there's a lot riding on this election. But for the next 2 years, the big issue is, can Joe Biden govern if he loses the House? And I think that's going to be a very rough proposition. Last point, I know we have to go. Last point is, at the end of the day, I think we have great perils facing this country in the short term. I'm fairly pessimistic the next 5 years or so. The longer term seems to be much more promising. And that is what I think we've been our hopes on. The generations that are coming, whether it's X or millennials or Z, they all have something to offer. And I think the time has come to pass the torch to these younger generations.
Dave Gergen, you've been generous with your time. I think I want to ask you just one more question real fast, and it's got to be a quick answer. Have you been surprised by the extent to which Trump has consolidated his grip on the GOP since last fall?
Yes, very surprised. The J.D. Vance thing was like, whoa, that's an unholy alliance.
And do you expect that to continue through the fall?
Oh yeah, yeah. I think Trump's going to throw the dice now. He'll win some, lose some, but he'll always be out there in front. He has a great capacity to raise money, and I think he'll continue to hold the party hostage as long as he can. If things happen to his health, that changes the whole ballgame.
David Gergen, thanks for being with us, the author of the just released Hearts Touched with Fire, How Great Leaders Are Born. Dave, thanks so much for spending time today.
Thank you, Michael. I enjoyed being with you again.
Always good to talk to you. As always, to everyone else, thanks for watching. To check out what other interviews we have coming up, please go to WashingtonPostLive.com to find out more and to register for any events that you'd like to hear. Thank you so much to Dave Gergen again, and thank you so much to you for joining us today. I'm Michael Duffy.